which about 50% of children under 5 years of age, which is our future, have stunted growth in South Asia. Therefore, it is critical for the governments in South Asia to improve the access to diverse, nutritious food and eradicate hunger, particularly for the poor and marginalized populations. So in order to reduce food insecurity and hunger, the most important aspect is the reliable information regarding key indicators for resilient food system, which is lacking particularly at the local level. Climate change and inadequate institutional support and capacities are some other limiting factor to ensure food insecurity and reduce hunger. Along these challenges to food systems, COVID-19 pandemic has also posed additional adverse impact on agriculture and food system in South Asia. During the lockdown and mobility restrictions, we observed number of challenges such as unavailability of transport to deliver farm produce to market. We observed shortage of labor and farmers limited access to market and reducing supplies of some of export items due to the export restrictions imposed by the producing countries. So to make this food system resilient, policymakers, professionals, and researchers need a better understanding of the implication of COVID-19 pandemic on food systems, which is the main goal of this panel. Therefore, we are looking at some key questions here, such as how to respond COVID-19 pandemic in the past and also in the future events, while looking at the pre-existing vulnerabilities of food system in South Asia, how to ensure smooth functioning of agriculture activities, food supply chain, such as in the time of COVID-19 through short and medium-term policy steps. Third, how to improve access to affordable food, particularly for the poor and marginalized population beyond the pandemic. And lastly, how to sustain agribusiness, create and retain jobs in agro-based industry and trade, while facilitating the farmers to thrive through better access to market and institutional support. So in this regard, we have the 5 case studies from Nepal, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan, which will be presenting in this panel. So the panel is chaired by Syed Fakhar Imam, Federal Minister, National Food Security and Research, Government of Pakistan. We have a special and welcoming remarks by Dr. Abid Suleri. So before moving to the welcome remarks and the presentations, there is some housekeeping announcements, which are each panelist have 10 minutes to deliver their presentations. The session will be recorded. While presenting, the panelists are requested to unmute their microphone and start on the video. Audience can ask questions from the panelists through Q&A tab. These questions will be answered by respective panelists at the end of the 5 presentations. Panelists are required to frequently monitor the Q&A tab. At the end of session, so we are requested you to open your cameras to take group photo. Now I'd like to request Dr. Abdul Qayyum Suleri for welcome remarks. Dr. Abdul Qayyum Suleri is a social policy analyst and development practitioner with a PhD in food security from University of Greenwich, UK. He has been executive director of Sustainable Development Policy Institute. Dr. Suleri gives policy advice and serve as on various policy forums, advisory boards at national, regional, and international levels. Currently, he is a member of Prime Minister Economic Advisory Council, member of National Advisory Committee of Planning Commission of Pakistan, and the Trade Policy Advisory Committee of Government of Pakistan. He served as a board of studies of various universities and also a member of Government of Punjab Vice Chancellor's Search Committee for Agriculture Universities in Pakistan. Recently, he is appointed by the Prime Minister of Pakistan as a convener, National Coordination Committee on Agriculture Transformation Plan. Over to you, Dr. Abid.
Sir, Dr. Abid has not joined yet. He hasn't received link. I requested Abid to share link with him.
Okay, sorry for some delay. So should we start for the first presentation and then we ask requested? Yes, Dr. Saab is online now. Dr. Abid, can we request for the welcoming remarks for the panel?
Well, thank you, Kashif. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear panelists from across South Asia and beyond, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are based now and from where you are following this important discussion. Thanks, Kashif, for choosing this very important topic of building resilience in a local food supply system. And if we remember when this COVID started, there were three warnings which were given to the world. One was, of course, about the disease itself. The second was about an emerging food crisis, and third was an economic recession. We didn't saw the type of food crisis which we were warned about, but that requires more preparedness, and that requires us to remain prepared about any future disaster. And perhaps that was the reason that the United Nations changed its focus from food security to food systems, of course, from field to fork. This is something which can bring a paradigm shift in ways we produce, in ways we consume, we eat, we spend, and one has to ensure in order to remain food secure is that those food systems, those remain intact. In Pakistan, government of Pakistan is giving an added focus to agriculture. As most of you would know that agriculture was devolved to provinces after 18th Amendment in the Constitution back in this devolution. Federal government is again giving emphasis towards the agriculture. SDPI has the honor to steer the process. I am the convener for Prime Minister's Coordination Committee on Agriculture Transformation Plan. And this Agriculture Transformation Plan, it looks at smart and precision agriculture, meaning a climate resilient agriculture. It tries to improve food supply chains and food systems through warehouses and through improving the food value chains. And it talks of irrigation and mechanization in agronomic practices, again, in order to adapt to climate change. So with the support of all of you who are here today as panelists, will inshallah try to transform agriculture in Pakistan. Was to seek your guidance and to seek your support in this process. I'll conclude with this, that most of the think tanks, their problem is access to the decision makers. SDPI is in a unique position and in a unique situation where we have direct access at the highest level, but we require doable, pragmatic solutions to remain part of solution. And those solutions, some of them, I am sure that those would come through the discussion today. And I can assure you that we'll take it to the highest level of decision making. Thank you very much for joining. Over to you, Kashif.
Thank you, Dr. Abid, for describing the activities or the policy actions is taken by the government of Pakistan regarding the food system security and this sustainable agriculture. So with further ado, let me introduce our first panelist. Our first panelist is Ms. Dikshya Singh. She is a program coordinator at South Asia Watch on Trade, Economics and Environment, SAWTEE, Kathmandu, Nepal, where she is involved in research on transboundary cooperations and livelihood concerns in South Asia. She will be presenting on fighting the pandemic, food system resilience in Nepal. Over to you, Dikshya.
Thank you, Kashif. Can I share my screen? Okay, so again, I have the control of the screen.
Yes, sure.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I can't share the screen. So anyway, I think I will queue. So anyway, I think we can start the presentation and I can queue the.
You can start the presentation, then we just drop your, move to the next slide. So if you ask this.
Okay, sure.
Yes, yeah.
Sure. Okay, so thank you. First of all, I would like to thank SDPI for this opportunity. This opportunity to contribute to this important discourse. In today's session, I will be highlighting how the COVID-19 pandemic impacted Nepal's food system and the lessons that could be drawn from it. The presentation is based on a study undertaken by SAWTEE with IPS Sri Lanka for Southern Voice that looked into resiliency of food system in these countries. So I'll be sharing the findings and observations from the Nepal side research. Can we start the slideshow? So the research basically assesses the impact of the first wave of the pandemic on rice and vegetable value chains. Since rice and vegetables are a staple in daily food consumption of Nepali people, these items were selected for the study. Moreover, rice farming contributes as much as 7% in Nepal's GDP, so it sort of signals the direction of economy as well. So this study is basically a value chain analysis. It uses mixed methods, both quantitative and qualitative approaches has been used. The findings are based on the both primary and secondary data sources. We talked to and interviewed more than 70 stakeholders for this. This was done during the immediately after the first wave of the pandemic. So what happened in the second wave, this study does not include that. So with next slide, okay. With the detection of few cases of COVID-19, Nepal imposed lockdown from March 12 to from end of March, late March to July, beginning of the July. So impacts of but there were lockdown imposed in different places in Nepal for next couple of months. So during lockdown, movement of people was restricted and all the businesses were shut down. So the lockdown almost brought all the economic activities to a halt. The lockdown hit food security situation by compromising availability, accessibility, and affordability of food. For example, lockdown affected supply of inputs that affected production, thus availability was impacted, while shutdown of markets and disruptions in transportation broke supply chain of food products, impacting accessibility, and halt in economic activities hit income of people, while supply disruptions led to increase in prices, which resulted in making food unaffordable to vulnerable people. Next slide, please. So the impact of this impact is mostly of impact of the lockdown was in the first 6 months of the lockdown. What happened was more than creating new problems, pandemic worsened the existing issues in Nepal's food system. So major disruptions were experienced in sourcing inputs like fertilizers, seeds, and pesticides. For example, fertilizer shortages were not a new thing for Nepal during plantation seasons, but the pandemic worsened the shortages and prevented any alternative sourcing possibilities as well. So similarly, restricted movement means access to agriculture extension services were disrupted, and disruptions in marketing supply chain also caused shortages at markets while farmers were not able to sell their products. So the pandemics also reduced coping ability of the actors in the value chain. the disruption left many consumers vulnerable to food and nutrition security. A study done by Agriculture Ministry, federal government's Agriculture Ministry, and WFP Nepal found that 20% households had inadequate food consumption and 12% had adopted to negative coping strategy by the 5th month since the lockdown. Next slide, please. So the value chain actors in both vegetable and rice value chains are similar, with smallholder farmers and then collectors, processors, cooperatives, wholesalers, and retailers. So there are like little variation among the actors, but links are almost similar. And there's a persistent informal network between these actors too. For example, this is mostly with the rice value chain. Farmers often take credit during plantation season from collectors by promising them to sell them the harvest at a certain rate. The rate at which they borrow, so the price, the rate that they agree upon are most of the time less than the prevalent prices. So, and since Nepal's farming belt is in the Tarai plains or near the plains that border India, so such informal nexus also crosses the border to India as well. So, and another factor about Nepal is that Nepal is import dependent in the selected staples. So imported rice make up to nearly 15% of the total available stock, and that includes paddy and rice both. And Nepal imports as much as 40% of total domestic consumption of vegetables. So almost all of the trade of these food items are with India. So the disruptions at border also impacted food security situation in Nepal. The next slide, please. So impact on rice value chain is so there was not much impact on the rice value chain, it appears, although Nepal, so that's because the paddy plantation season had already begun. So paddy plantation season began only after the lockdown was lifted. So there was not much effect on that front, but lockdown definitely affected the procurement of fertilizer at the government level and then distribution as well. So which resulted in acute shortage and lockdown of India-Nepal border, which is open border. So there was strict lockdown imposed in the border area as well. So it also caused delays. It also prevented procurement of informal procurement of fertilizer from Indian border, as well as lockdown in India also caused delays in transporting the fertilizer consignment that were already on the way to Nepal. So despite all this, price of rice varieties in the market did not see much fluctuation. However, retailers did report that households were buying less quantity as their income suffered. Next slide, please. So, however, the vegetable value chain was quite affected due to lockdown and the pandemic because they reported having shortage of labor, and there was disrupted access to agriculture extension services offered by the government, which impacted their harvest and all that. And vegetable prices were quite volatile during the review period, as they were reported that there was 50 to 100% of price rise reported, vegetable price rise reported. But at the same time, vegetable farmers and traders report that there was drop in 60%, around 60% in sales of vegetables. So it can be inferred that the supply chain disruptions left both consumers and producers at loss. Though the traders reported there were less sales, but there was import of vegetables from India increased by 35%. And this also signals the lack of coordination between domestic producers and the markets. Next slide, please. So based on the study, some areas of interventions that seem necessary to make food system resilient in Nepal are as follows. In Nepal, producers suffered from shortage of necessary inputs caused by the pandemic, which could constrict availability of food. That's why a robust logistic system seems to be quite necessary in place to not to ensure that supply of inputs as well as produce are properly managed during difficult times like pandemic or during any other kind of disasters. So in terms of fertilizer, Nepal government had started purchasing fertilizer from Bangladesh in 2021 after the whole mishap of 2020. However, as global fertilizer prices are skyrocketing, it remains to be seen how the government will take this matter forward. Similarly, food insecurity caused by income shocks has proven that food-related social security programs for vulnerable is essential. It could be achieved by strengthening public and private procurement systems of food. Such public procurement programs not only help in food delivery to the needy, but also ensures that farmers receive minimum support price for their produce, which could prevent any panic selling by farmers. Next slide, please. So, yeah, and similarly, local food processing industry should be facilitated in Nepal as it helps to create better market linkages between the producers and consumers. Anecdotal incidences show that Nepali farmers are selling their produce informally to Indian processors, which in turn is sold back to Nepal. So that's because food processing is not as efficient in Nepal as it's across the border. So another important issue that emerges time and again with regard to farming is the need of having robust agri-financing services to farmers. Availability of cheap and easy formal credit is a key to support farmers and prevent them from falling into predatory informal lending. Another issue that comes up that has emerged after the pandemic is that the pandemic has called attention to the need to have greater digitalization in agriculture service delivery. Agriculture extension services could use digital tool for an effective service delivery. They could use just mobile phone services and SMS services to for that purpose. Likewise, facilitating e-commerce service could be crucial aspect in commercializing agriculture in Nepal, and also to address accessibility and affordability issues in the food system. E-commerce does not mean only at the retail level marketing, but e-commerce and digital solutions that connect producers and markets too seems to be necessary. Thank you. I think this is it for now. You can check the full report as it has more information on the food system, how the food system coped during the first year of the pandemic in Nepal. You can connect me in the email displayed if you need any Nepal specific information. Thank you.
Thank you, Dikshya, for a very wonderful presentation and discussing the food consumption and value chain disruption during the COVID, and also discuss the trade disruptions with India, and also the issues of food processing challenges faced by the food industry. So we will, of course, you can share your the link of your presentation, link of your publication in the chat box, so the audience can get benefit from that. We will come to you with some questions later on. Now, I'd like to request our next panelist, Dr. Manoj Thibbotuwawa, a research fellow, Institute of Policy Studies, Colombo, Sri Lanka. Dr. Manoj is a research fellow, and his research interests include agriculture, food security, and environmental and natural resource economics. He has more than 50 years of research experience at IPS. Manoj has MPhil in agriculture economics and holds a PhD from University of Western Australia. He has also obtained a postgraduate diploma in modeling and accounting for sustainable development from the International Institute of Social Studies in The Hague. The title of his presentation is Building Resilient Agriculture Value Chains During the COVID-19. Over to you, Dr. Manoj.
Thank you very much, Kashif. Let me share my slides. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can see your presentation slides.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So my presentation title is Food System Resilience: Lessons from the COVID-19 Pandemics from Sri Lanka. This is kind of a parallel study that SAWTEE colleague presented that we did with Southern Vice Secretariat. Agriculture sector makes a significant contribution to the economic and social development as well as for food and nutrition security in Sri Lanka. The sector accounted for 7% for the country's GDP and generated about 21% of national export earnings in 2019. The sector employs a quarter of the country's labor force. It's actually its importance is even larger in rural areas where agriculture engages more than half of the workforce. A major share of agriculture employees is classified as part-time farmers who spend more time in non-agricultural activities. In terms of domestic food availability in Sri Lanka, it's largely determined by the domestic production and imports of food crops, livestock products, and fish. Domestic agriculture provided approximately 70% of the food requirement in 2019. Only about 30% of the food requirement is imported. I'm presenting these statistics because the impact of COVID-19 can come from both the domestic production side as well as from the import side. So in terms of domestic production, Sri Lanka is nearly self-sufficient in rice, which is the staple food of Sri Lanka, and also the local production of most of the other plant-based food sources that include vegetables, fruits, root crops, etc. exceeds 75% of the total availability. In terms of the animal protein sources, domestic production of meat, milk, fish, and eggs exceed 85%. In terms of food imports, the food and beverage imports account for about 10% of total imports earnings in the country, and it mainly consists of milk, fish, sugar, onion, and spices. So those four products, milk, fish, sugar, and onions, accounts for about 60% of total food beverage import costs. So it's a significant burden to the local economy. So this is kind of a simplified conceptual framework for the study that we conducted. So it shows that possible vulnerabilities of the food systems due to COVID-19 pandemic. As you can see here, trade restrictions can reduce the supply of inputs, and fuel prices can cause input price fluctuation. Both of these could result in expensive input as well as input shortages. And labor movement restrictions can decline access to labor. Market closure and transport restrictions can result in food loss and wastages. So both of these can result in reduction of agriculture production. Other than that, unemployment, higher food prices, and reduced economic activity could result in low income generation and debts among households. So all these can significantly affect the food security in terms of availability, access, and utilization. So within this background, I'm going to broadly look at the impact of the pandemic on the food system with the aim of making some policy recommendation to increase the resilience of the food system. So methodology of our study, as SAWTEE colleague mentioned, that we focused on rice and vegetable value chains because of several reasons. One is a large portion of the diet of Sri Lankans are coming from rice and vegetables. So it's very important for food security, and a significant share of people are engaged in paddy and vegetable cultivation. So it's very important for rural poverty reduction. And also vegetables and rice supply chains massively disrupted by COVID-19 pandemic. So because of these reasons, we selected those products. And in this study, we mainly use both secondary and primary data from different sources and primary data from computer-aided telephonic interviews using structured questionnaire with different stakeholders. So So as the figure shows that domestic crop production has seen only minimal disruptions, mainly because harvesting of the 2020 Maha crop season had already been completed by the time of the first wave of the COVID-19 outbreak in Sri Lanka, which was in March 2020. So the lockdown started from March 2020. By that time, we have completed the Maha season. Maha season means in Sri Lanka, we have two separate seasons, Maha and Yala. Maha season starts from December and it goes up to February. So March, the lockdown started in March 2020, and Yala season starts from May and it goes up to around September. So, and also in terms of 2020 Yala season, it was also didn't affect much because of the COVID pandemic, because we had that prolonged lockdown since March. But by the time we start the Yala season, lockdown had been lifted in May 2020. The government lifted the lockdown. So the Yala season also didn't affect because of the COVID-19 restrictions. So the Yala season was also some form of favorable one. But in 2020 Maha season, it also had minimum disruptions, disturbances from the COVID-19 outbreak, because even though we had several small kind of very shorter lockdowns, it didn't much affect the 2020 Maha crop season. The problem started in 2021 Yala season, because one reason is the third wave of the COVID-19 lockdown, and also government reason policy change on banning inorganic fertilizer and agrochemicals in Sri Lanka. So, so it is expected that 2020 Yala season will not be, 2021 Yala season will not be a good one. So we will have some problems in terms of food security. So here you can see the main food imports, changes in main food imports in Sri Lanka. No significant change in food imports due to COVID-19 has been observed until 2020. As you can see here, so over the years, amount of food imports hasn't changed much. Share of food and beverages imports in total imports has been 10% in 2020, and it's also a significant increase from the previous 2 years, which was around 7-8%. And also during the first 6 months of 2020, the contribution of food and beverages in total imports was 9%, which is also equivalent to the average share recorded in last 3 years. So as from this figure, what we can conclude is that there was no much impact on food imports because of the COVID-19. So as you see, the national level food availability aspects discussed earlier indicated only a slight impact from COVID-19 on domestic food supply, but there were some impacts on micro-level dynamics of food supply, such as labor mobility, access to inputs, output quantity, prices, because of this COVID-19 related containment measures. In this graph, you can see about 36% of farmers had spent lesser number of days during the pandemic on their crop cultivation related to the COVID-19 before COVID-19 period. Also, 40% of the farmers work lesser number of days in other farmers as hired labor, and also 47% of farmers use lesser number of days as hired labor in other farms. In this graph, you can see restriction on input use. Approximately 23% of the farmers planted less seed compared to the same season last year, while only 20% didn't have access to seed. Additionally, about 23% of the farmers used less fertilizer, and only 4% didn't have access to fertilizer. In terms of chemicals, also about 45% of farmers used fewer chemicals, and only 3% didn't use chemicals. In this graph, you can see input price dynamics. About 44% of farmers had to pay a higher price for purchasing seed, And also 31% farmers had to pay a higher price for chemicals. In terms of fertilizer, it is 25%. So this all these mainly can be related to the restrictions on importing certain inputs, as well as logistical problems due to COVID-19 pandemic. In this graph, you can see about 25% of farmers had received an output lesser than the previous year, and about 33% farmers had received relatively lower output price during the same period. So what this reveals is the inherent problem of marketing in Sri Lankan agriculture, where farmers often fail to receive a fair price. So even though despite measures to ensure food security by the government, markets across Sri Lanka saw price spikes for food commodities due to the logistical challenges posed by the pandemic and the lockdown. So as you can see here in this graph, the National Consumer Price Index, NCPI, for food increased by 11% from March 2020 to May 2020. So COVID-19 first lockdown started from March 2020. During this period, 11% food NCPI increased, but overall inflation increased only by 6%. Also, the gap between NCPI food and NCPI overall shows an increase in trend since first lockdown in March 2020. You can see these two graphs, its gap is widening. Also, food inflation average about 10.6 during all three waves started from March 2020, as opposed to 5.5% overall inflation. Though this can see you can see that inherent problem of food systems in Sri Lanka, which was aggravated by the COVID-19 pandemic. In this graph also, you can see rice price also in late 2020 and 2021. It shows that very rapidly increasing. It's not following the same pattern that we had during last couple of years. And also in this graph, you can see other food commodities also showing some kind of price spikes, especially during lockdown periods. Here in this period, March period, 2020 to 2020 March period, it's when we started the first lockdown, we can see a price spikes, and even in the second lockdown, we can see a price spikes, and even in the third lockdown. So this shows that we had several price spikes because of the COVID-19 and the resultant lockdown period. So if you look at the main reason for such a situation in food system in Sri Lanka, it's not necessarily the COVID-19 pandemic, but the aggravation of inherent structural problems in the food systems during the pandemic. So basically the food system is organized as interconnected value chains, which comprise of different players. So there are several challenges in the value chain affecting the food system resilience in the country. With regards to the main challenges in the value chain, we can highlight producers are poorly connected with the markets, and intermediaries gain arbitrage opportunities by this. And also rural producers receive lower prices due to lack of market information, also poor infrastructure and small scale production, weaker bargaining position, and lengthy marketing channel. Also, we can see inefficient resource management by farmers, especially the inputs like fertilizer, and inadequate availability of good quality seeds, inadequate use of modern techniques, seasonality, high percentage of post-harvest losses, especially due to inappropriate handling during storage and transportation, and other major constraints in the value chain. So also, even though various forms of incentives are provided by the government to promote value-added products, the share of value-added products is very low, and also limited access to capital by farmers and also small and medium processors is also a major constraint in promoting value-added production. So now what is clearly seen here is, without addressing structural issues pertaining to the food system in Sri Lanka, it is unlikely that short-term and medium-term intervention can help to create a resilient food system. So talking about ways of improving food system resilience, I would like to highlight ABCD of food system resilience: agency, buffering, connectivity, and diversity. Agency means that capacity of people to mitigate risks and to respond to shocks, or adaptive capacity. And buffering is creation and maintenance of national, subnational, and regional food stocks. And connectivity, that is nature and strengthening the interactions between the various components in the food system. And also diversity at different scale and different places. So in terms of agency, it's very important to ensure smooth supply of input, especially the most of the required fertilizers in Sri Lanka is imported, and timely distribution of fertilizer is very important. This issue was aggravated during the COVID-19 period. Also, production of seeds need to be expanded, and public sector support in research and breeding programs is critical for this. In terms of agriculture extension and information dissemination, it's very important to improve the coordination in the delivery of extension services. Because in Sri Lanka, extension is handled by the provincial councils, provincial departments. So it's, but research is handled by the national. So there is a lack of coordination between the central and provincial governance and structure. Also, we can, the current situation could be taken as an opportunity to familiarize farmers with digital extension services, which is very lacking at present. And financing services, it's very important, because one of the major reasons why farmers agree to low farm gate price is the advance or loans they take from collectors. Since farmers' access to formal credit is very limited, so it's very important to review current available financing services, and providing concessionary credit schemes is very much important. And in terms of buffering, it's need to strengthen Sri Lanka's storage capacity and maintain buffer stock as essential food items as a national food bank with nodal points at the provincial council levels, and could be linked to SAWTEE food bank as well. And also, it's very important food related social security programs. We have one program called Samurdhi, but the targeting is very serious problem in this program. Therefore, even in the COVID-19 period, many vulnerable people didn't receive adequate support because of this poor targeting, even though program is there. And connectivity, increasing the capacity of e-commerce. So increased demand of digital marketing platform during the COVID-19 pandemic should be capitalized to promote the capacity of e-commerce at both ends of the supply chains. And also, it's very important to establish farm market linkages between farmers and buyers. So this will establish transparency in pricing and better value, especially for perishable products. It could also help to increase farmer incomes, especially to eliminating inessential intermediaries. Also, continuous monitoring of the food system is very important. In terms of diversity, we can consider both horizontal and vertical diversification. Horizontal mean at the level of enterprise level, and also vertical to the food processing level, which is very lacking in Sri Lanka. It's in Sri Lanka, it's food processing is concentrated in only a very few enterprises. So private investment in food processing is very low, and value addition is insufficient, mainly because of a lot of constraints such as policy constraints, access to finance, knowledge, and technology. So we have to focus on these areas. So I will stop here, and later we can discuss further.
Thank you, Dr. Manoj, for wonderful presentation and discussing the inherent and institutional and structural bottlenecks related to the food security in Sri Lanka. So we have a short of time, so we quickly move to now our next panelist, Professor Dr. Haque Bidisha, from Department of Economics, University of Dhaka, Bangladesh. Dr. Dr. Sayema. Dr. Sayema Haque is a professor in the Department of Economics, University of Dhaka, Bangladesh. She is also an honorary research director, South Asia Network on Economic Modeling. His research interest lies in labor economics and development economics involving empirical analysis. She completed her PhD in economics from University of Nottingham, UK in 2009. Her presentation title is Assessing Food Poverty, Vulnerability and Food Consumption, Inequality in the Context of COVID-19. Over to you, Dr.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Good afternoon. First of all, thanks to SDPI to invite me. Today, I will be discussing about food poverty and food vulnerability in the context of Bangladesh. Now, we all know that when we are talking about COVID-19, COVID-19 has affected people from all walks of life and all countries of the world. In the context of Bangladesh, it has affected as well, and because we have 85% of our labor force is in the informal sector. Now, despite the fact there is sign of recovery, and in comparison to many other countries, Bangladesh is recovering, I would say, quite rather satisfactory manner. But however, there are definitely some concerns related to the distributional context, especially when we are talking about the way COVID-19 has impacted the lives and livelihood of the people of the country. Now, in this context, I will be talking about, in fact, food poverty. Why food poverty? Because the poorer segment of the population, they spend a greater amount on food consumption. And from that point of view, there's also another thing that we would rather keep in mind, that is vulnerability. Why we need to consider about vulnerability as well? Because when we are talking about food poverty, when we are talking about poverty, we are talking about a static concept. But we need to think about it from a dynamic point of view. And from dynamic point of view, if you think about a concept which is vulnerability, that is something, the probability that an household, due to any shock, any risk or any uncertainty like the COVID-19, they cannot remain or maintain a minimum standard which is necessary for their daily livelihood. In that case, we would also need to know that whether the food consumption and food consumption inequality, that has also increased over time. Because the fact remains, when we are talking about COVID-19, poverty, inequality and probability to be poor or probability to be vulnerable, that is also important, and we should consider all of this thing together. I will not go into greater detail of the technical aspect, but because it's a technical paper, we use the data from the Household Income Expenditure Survey, and we try, which is the National Representative Survey of Bangladesh, and from that we utilize the food poverty threshold. And when we are talking about the food poverty threshold, there are like 11 items. Based on those items, we calculate the food poverty in the context of Bangladesh. Now, when we are talking about food poverty and the food vulnerability, one technical problem that we faced is like we don't have nationally representative panel data, which is nationally representative and published by the government. So, from that point of view, one alternative has been provided in the literature, and that has provided a methodology which utilizes cross-sectional data as well. Now, with the cross-sectional data, I will not go into greater detail, but basically what we try to do, we try to estimate a consumption function. So we try to estimate a food poverty line and food poverty, and from that, with the head count ratio and the food poverty gap ratio, we try to understand who are the food poor people. And Secondly, due to COVID, because there is a high volatility in consumption and there is a probability that many people might fall below poverty line, though they are not considered as food poverty, we need to think about the vulnerability concept. And from the vulnerability concept, what we try to do, we estimated a consumption function, and from the consumption function variance, there is a methodological way. I am not going into greater detail, but from that consumption functions variance, consumption functions error term variance, we try to estimate food vulnerability concept. And from with the food vulnerability concept, we as a rule of thumb, we consider that those people or those households for whom the probability of being vulnerable is more than 0.5, more than half of the average, we consider them food vulnerable. Now, from that point of view, I will just go into, rather than going into greater detail, I will just go into the basic results that we have found. Now, when we are talking about food consumption and food poverty, the fact remains that lower segment of the lower income segment of the people, they consume or they spend greater amount on food rather than non-food item. We know about the Ingalls law and all of this theoretical concept. Now, from that point of view, there is around like 35% food poor people, and from that 35% food poor people, we can see that there is a urban and rural divide, and from urban and rural divide, it is mostly rural driven. Now, as we already say that it is not food poverty, we also need to go beyond poverty, and we need to go think about like what happens to the people who face shock like COVID. Then we can think about a situation like food vulnerability. And for food vulnerability, we can see this 9% is showing that these households in general term, we don't generally consider them in the policy because they are not food poor. But due to any shock or any unforeseeable event like COVID-19, they might not be able, and there is high probability and high likelihood of them of not being able to maintain the minimum threshold necessary for maintaining the day-to-day activities. So there are around 9 to 10% of people who are households who are though not food poverty, but we can consider them new food poor because of the COVID, these people might not be able to maintain minimum daily necessities. And we also see that it is also higher in rural area. Although the urban part has been strongly affected by COVID-19, it is higher in rural area because the rural people's supply chain and rural people's connection with the urban context, that is important as well. And if we want to go into greater detail, then we can see that I'm not going into other technical parts. We can see that there is regional variation, and there is a strong regional variation, and there is also strong variation in terms of the environment, because we see that food poverty is higher in some areas, like those areas which are prone to river erosion, those areas which are prone to drought, those areas which are coastal areas, and especially the probability to be more vulnerable and probability of not being able to maintain the minimum necessary food consumption, those people are quite high when we are talking about the people in the drought areas. So because of the agricultural facilities and all of these facts. So environment is one aspect which we should keep into our mind, because normal poverty estimate and even normal food poverty estimate might not capture the actual picture. The another thing is like these are the common factors. I'm not going into detail, but this shows that some people who are more vulnerable to in case of any shock in income. And who are these people? These people are those who has lesser education. These people are those who are working in the agriculture sector. These people are those who are daily laborer or those who are self-employed. Also, there's another thing that we must keep in mind is like the household composition, because in terms of the household composition, what we have seen that the probability of the people to be new food poor, those are much higher for those households who have more than 2 old people, those who have more than 2 or 3 children in the household. So the demographic composition of the household also makes them very vulnerable to food poverty. From that point of view, now if I want to conclude, then what we got in our analysis is like, basically we have to think about not only poverty, but also food poverty when we are talking about the poorer segment of the population. We also think about, and we also need to construct and analyze food vulnerability, which can signify or which can indicate the probability of some new food poor people, and also the food inequality, which I haven't discussed because of the technical aspect. And another issue is like, there are factors which affect this food vulnerability especially, and these aspects are not only occupational aspect, not only education, but also the demographic factors of the household. And these factors play important role when we are talking about, and these factors can make a household vulnerable when we are talking about situation like COVID-19. So what is the policy implication? Because in order to, when we are talking about the backdrop of COVID-19, understanding food poverty and food vulnerability is particularly important for getting better insights of food consumption deficiency and food insecurity for across different income segments of the household. We have calculated for different income segments, but I'm not showing it because of the technical aspects and to motivate the analysis further. Secondly, when we are talking about any policy, we must think about the policies, two important aspects of the policies. One is the social safety net issue, and the secondly is the issue of the incentive package of the government for those who has been affected by COVID-19. And from these two aspects, the one important thing is very crucial, which is like identifying who are poor. But while identifying who are poor, we might, if we do not consider the food vulnerability people, then we might sort of ignore those people who are vulnerable and who might be severely hit hard because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So this study basically tried to identify and target those people who have different categories of food vulnerable people for government social safety net and COVID-19 incentive packages. And also another thing we must need to consider is like the government national, we have a national social security, social safety net program, and that social safety net program that can include a public insurance scheme targeting these food vulnerable population. And also there are some digitalization of the social safety net program and self-claim system, local and sector-based listing. These can be very important to identify these households, which we have already tried to identify in our paper, in order to target them and in order to provide them support during who has been affected in the food COVID-19 in terms of the food consumption. So our research therefore can serve as a guideline for understanding the financial requirement for cash or in-kind transfer for those who has been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. So I would rather stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Sayema, for wonderful presentations and regarding the food poverty and vulnerability. Now we quickly move to Dr. Heather Ohly, who is experienced researcher with interest and expertise in nutrition, food security, and sustainable food system in low and middle income countries. She holds PhD in nutrition from University of Central Lancashire in 2017. Along with Dr. Sophie, along with Dr. Heather, Dr. Sophie is a senior researcher and technical advisor in urban nutrition research and program And Mr. Fakhar Abbas is a vulnerability analysis and mapping officer at the UN World Food Program, Islamabad, Pakistan. This paper and presentation will be developed in coordination with the World Food Program Regional Bureau, Bangkok, Thailand. The title of presentation is a case studies on urban food system in Peshawar, COVID-19 food security and resilience. Over to you, Dr. Heather.
Thank you. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can see your slides.
All right, thank you. So I'm Heather Ohly. Thanks for the introduction. And as mentioned, I'm here with my colleagues, Sophie Goudet from Dakota and Iftikhar Abbas from the World Food Programme. And we're really pleased to be able to share this case study on urban food systems resilience in Peshawar, Pakistan. So as has already been mentioned by previous speakers, the COVID-19 pandemic led to increased levels of hunger, food insecurity and undernourishment in the Asia-Pacific region. And the urban poor have been disproportionately affected by the spread of the virus and measures to contain it. So there has never been a greater urgency to transform food systems to become more efficient, resilient, inclusive and sustainable. So this study was carried out between January and April 2021. Its aims were to assess the impacts of COVID-19 on urban food systems in 8 selected cities in Asia and the Pacific, and to characterise levels of vulnerability and resilience in urban food systems. So the 8 cities we studied are shown on the map: Chittagong, Cox's Bazar, Dhaka, Jakarta, Kabul, Peshawar, Phnom Penh, and Quezon City, Metro Manila. A range of methods and data sources were used to characterise urban food systems and assess the impacts of COVID-19, including surveys with food system actors, the private sector, local governments, UN agencies, NGOs. Key information.
Sorry for interruption. We are not able to see the next slide. So are you? Are you on the first slide or
I'm on the second slide right now.
So it's not moving down.
Let me try and move it again.
Yes, and
can you see it now?
Yes, we can see it now, but can we move down so we can understand it's properly working?
Sorry, I'm not sure what you're asking there.
Can we do it from here so that you can just ask us to move forward?
Yes.
So
oh, yes, of course.
Yes,
I'll
okay.
stop sharing. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. यहाँ से
I'll just carry on the overview of the methods. So we did key informant interviews as well as our surveys, secondary data analysis using city level data when it was available, and also geospatial data and mapping. And we used the food systems dashboard as a conceptual framework to guide our analysis. That's it, thank you. So the food systems dashboard framework is there. You won't be able to see the detail of it. And we adapted this to develop a typology of resilience in urban food systems, which I'll come on to. Next slide, please. So the first component of food systems that we looked at were external drivers or macro level factors that shape urban food systems. So these 2 maps of Peshawar city were developed by our urban planning expert, Martin Clark. The map on the left, oh, sorry, previous slide. Number 3. The map on the left summarises urbanisation trends showing areas of high population density and growth. Could you move to the previous slide, please? Lovely, thank you. So the map on the left summarises urbanisation trends. The thicker white line is the boundary of Peshawar Municipal Corporation. And you can see that around 20% of the urban population lives outside of this boundary, if you look at the pink areas. The map on the right shows different types of land cover, including cultivated land in green. So you can see that just over a third of the land within a 50-kilometre radius of the city is cultivated for food production. And the city relies on food imported from more productive agricultural areas of the country. These maps illustrate the relationship cities have with food production and highlight areas of urban vulnerability during crises that affect the food system. Next slide, please. So next we considered food supply chains and food availability during the pandemic. Urban areas typically have longer and more complex food supply chains than rural areas, which makes them more susceptible to disruptions during shocks, such as COVID-19. Our private sector surveys provided insights into the extent and nature of disruption to food supply chains and the impact on businesses in the food sector. So in Peshawar, we found that 90% of small and medium-sized enterprises reported moderate or severe disruption to food supply chains and also to access to customers and markets. 79% of business owners reported lower income during the pandemic, and 26% said they had lost over half their income. Adaptations to cope with lower income included taking business loans, selling assets, investing personal money, and finding other ways to reduce costs. Next slide, please. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the combination of increased food prices and loss of income meant that food became unaffordable for many people in cities who were not previously considered vulnerable to food insecurity. The graph on the right-hand side of this slide shows monthly food prices for four selected food items during 2020. The average increase across these four foods was 17%, and the largest increase was 27% for chicken. In the same period, the household income fell by 67% in urban areas of KP province. Daily wage earners and informal sector workers were among the worst affected by loss of income across the region. And many people in urban areas were not registered for social protection, so they had no financial buffer, making them highly susceptible to debt and food insecurity. In response, the government of Pakistan launched the SAS Emergency Cash Programme in April 2020, with inclusive eligibility criteria to account for increasing vulnerability in urban areas. Between April and October 2020, more than 15 million of the most vulnerable families were provided with financial assistance of 12,000 Pakistani rupees to buy rations to alleviate hunger. So on this slide, we can see that nutritional vulnerability has increased in Peshawar during the COVID-19 pandemic. Moderate or severe food insecurity increased from 18% in 2018 to 37% in 2020. Child wasting increased from 6% in 2018 to 14% in 2020. Unfortunately, we were not able to assess the impact on diet quality. The diagram on the right shows our typology of resilience for Peshawar city. We selected one key indicator for each component of the food system, such as proximity to cultivated land for external drivers and reduction in household income for individual factors. We did not identify an appropriate indicator for consumer behaviour. For diet outcomes, we selected minimum dietary diversity for women, but no data were available for Peshawar or KP. Further details about the development of this typology are available in our conference paper, but this is a simplified classification system that highlights opportunities for transformation in Peshawar's food system. So if you could move on to the next slide, please. This shows our recommendations based on findings from all 8 cities included in our study, as well as Peshawar. So we recommended a series of approaches to strengthen the resilience of urban food systems. Providing financial support and technical assistance to SMEs in the food sector to protect the integrity of food supply chains and facilitate transformative adaptations to current and future shocks. strengthen food supply chains by connecting small urban vendors with rural suppliers, and developing communication platforms to reach urban poor households and improve access to affordable and healthy foods. Social protection and safety net programs that are adaptive and responsive to shocks and support those worst affected, including the urban poor. Urban agriculture programs to enable city residents and communities to grow their own food and generate additional income. And then the final slide is our methodological recommendations. So we need standardized indicators of resilience and vulnerability to facilitate comparisons between cities. Also further development and application of this typology of urban food system resilience, which may be used as an operational tool to identify priorities and opportunities to strengthen resilience. And innovative approaches to defining urban areas and collecting city-specific data, such as combining local surveys with spatial and remotely sensed data, which we feel can bring unique insights. So thank you to my colleagues from Dakota and the World Food Programme, and we'll be happy to join in the discussion later. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Heather. So we quickly move to Mr. Joseph George so that we can have some time for discussion. Joseph George is a trade analyst in UNESCAP, New Delhi, where he provides research support for implementation of UNESCAP projects and programs on regional trade, connectivity and economic integration in South Asia. He has more than 10 years of work experience on development issues of South Asia. His co-authored work include the Doha Round and South Asia Needs for Better Coordination, and recently edited a book on regional cooperation for sustainable food security in South Asia. So he is presenting some key findings from this book. So his title of presentation is Regional Cooperation for Food Security in South Asia. Over to you, Dr. Joseph George.
Thank you, Kashif. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Let me share my presentation.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, here we go.
Yes.
So thank you again. Let me join my fellow panelists in thanking SDPI for this platform to share some thoughts on this topic. I will speak about regional dimensions of food security from the point of view that achievement of Goal 2, the Zero Hunger target, will be difficult to manage by any country alone. Obviously, because many of the policy options and solutions that we need for ensuring food security require regionally coordinated actions. If we look at the overall SDG progress made so far by South Asia, it is well known by now that the sub-region is lagging behind on all the 17 SDGs. In fact, we are regressing on a few of them. On Goal 2, like in all other goals, the progress made so far is less than expected levels as of 2020. Here you can see the dashboard, which indicates that on most of the targets for which data is available on prevalence of hunger, sustainable agriculture, etc., South Asia needs an accelerated rate of progress to reach the targets by 2030. But I must mention here that these are sub-regional averages, and there are wide variations in the levels of achievements when we consider each country individually. Well, the overall food security challenges of South Asia is quite well known. We have the second highest rate of prevalence of undernourishment in the world. But in absolute terms, South Asia has the highest hunger burden in the world, with about 400 million people suffering from the food deprivation. And COVID-19 has obviously aggravated the situation. But what is even more alarming is that the rate of reduction of prevalence of undernourishment, which is kind of the headline indicator for food security, that has slowed down over the years, and it has even reversed in recent years. So you see from the graph here that this reversal had started around 2017, 2018, even before the onset of the pandemic. So this is of great concern. And this implies that the kind of policies that we have been following to address food security in the region obviously needs to be kind of revisited. So it is in this context that the discussion on regional cooperation for food security becomes even more relevant and important today. There are many ways through which regional cooperation becomes relevant for food security. Perhaps the most important among them is that of trade in food and agriculture as a market correction mechanism, which can influence food security from both availability and access angles. Then equally critical is the issue of climate change, which affects food systems the most. Climate change essentially is a transboundary issue, and it goes without saying that cooperation is absolutely necessary to tackle it. Then there are issues of agriculture R&D, where smaller countries have capacity limitations and they need support from other countries. Then there are lots of mutual gains to be had from learning from each other's food security policies, etc. But in the interest of time, I would rather pick the first two topics mentioned here, trade and climate action. Well, trade is already included as a means of implementation target under Goal 2. In fact, there are 3 MOI targets for Goal 2, all of which essentially call for trade reforms to address food market distortions. Trade is perhaps more important for South Asia than any other region from the perspective of food security, because one of the most common feature in all our countries is the structural imbalance, which is tipped against the agriculture sector. We have moved away from agriculture to services sectors, often bypassing industrial growth. Agriculture now accounts for, on an average, 30% of the GDP in most of our countries, or even less. But the share of agriculture workforce remains at around 60% or even more. So this clearly means that the per capita income of agriculture dependents are very low, often having a lot of what we call disguised unemployment. So we are talking about people who produce food but often cannot afford to consume it. So the extra market opportunities afforded to them by trade is so critical for improving their income and consequently their food security. So that's one. And then we are also a sub-region which experiences sudden food price inflation due to seasonality and a host of other reasons. This is especially so in the case of non-cereal food items. So trade is important for price stability to a large extent. And we see that often in the case of onion prices, for example, when triggered by sudden inflation, we see a lot of intra-regional trade in vegetables happening. And then there is a point of possibility of more food product diversity in the market due to trade and what it can do positively for nutrition. So if you see the possibilities of trade, the potential for food trade is grossly underestimated in the sub-region, and there's a lot we can gain from achieving the potential. Let's take a quick look at the current trends of agriculture trade in South Asia. Intra-regional trade constitutes only about 4% of, just about 4% of total agriculture trade. Most of this trade is with partners outside the sub-region for both exports and imports. And if you look at the first table here, with the exception of landlocked countries of the sub-region, Afghanistan, Bhutan, and Nepal, this is the case for all South Asian countries. Another feature is that average import tariffs for food products are generally higher than industrial products, ranging from 7 to 24%. And this, we are talking about preferential tariffs that are applied under SAWTEE or even bilateral arrangements. MFN rates are generally upwards of 20% or even higher. While this is the case, we also see low utilization rate of available preferential tariffs, meaning that most of the trade that is on trade in food is taking the MFN rates. Also, it is a quite well-known fact that the standards applied on agriculture products are much more stringent than non-agricultural products. So these have acted as barriers to trade in food. But the question is, are there enough product complementarity for trade? In the South Asian context, it is generally assumed that most of the countries produce similar products and their export baskets are similar. So there is not much scope for trade. But what we observe here is that this is not true if you look at products at a disaggregated level. Well, the case of cereals may be different. South Asia is already a giant in terms of cereal exports, particularly rice. But this is not the case with respect to intra-regional trade, where fruits and vegetables, sweeteners, spices, etc. dominate than cereals. Not so much for meat and fish and marine food exports and exports of dairy products. But interestingly, we see that although these are fringe products in the context of intra-regional trade, but they have relatively higher share in their overall exports to the rest of the world. Moreover, we also can see that there are many product groups within the non-cereal crops, which are exported by some South Asian countries to partners outside the region, while the same product groups are imported by other South Asian countries from outside partners. So the question is this real? Does it really mean that there are product complementarities that can translate into more trade between South Asian countries? Sorry, I missed my slide here. So to find out the trade potential, we kind of employed what we call the aggregate market access frontier to find out the scenario. It basically measures how much each South Asian country can replace their current imports from world markets with imports from the neighborhood, given their respective supply capacities. So the result we got clearly showed that there is very high scope for trade in food products. The sum total of the market access frontier that captures how much potential there is combined together, it came out to be close to 10 billion USD across some 390, 400 different food products at a 6-digit level. While the actual current trade in this products is only about 2 billion USD. So that means that the scope for trade is at least 5 times the current levels. We also find that the price difference is also very high, meaning that actually some of the imports that we make from partners outside the region in these products is at a much higher price than what is available locally. So that has huge implications for improving the affordability of food through trade. And thirdly, and perhaps more importantly, we are not talking about a scenario leading to import surges here, but merely replacement of imports from one source to another, which is more cheaper and closer. So there is no reason why the current levels of import protection afforded to farm sector cannot be continued. So, which is always a sticking point when it comes to agriculture trade. So,
Joseph, can you shorten your presentation?
Yeah. So obviously, there is a huge scope, but the question is what we can do to boost trade here. We know that tariffs are still an issue. There are two things required here. First, we saw that many of the potential products which we identified using the analysis are still in the sensitive list. So we need to cut down them from the sensitive list. But that in itself will not be sufficient because we saw that preferential tariffs are not so low in the region. So cutting sensitive list, along with that, we need to bring down the preferential rates as well. Here, I would like to play with a proposal that perhaps it won't be a bad idea to allow very liberal safeguards for agriculture products given their sensitivities, because we have seen how debates on safeguards have frustrated agriculture negotiations at the WTO for many years. Then there is a host of standards and quarantine related issues to tackle. Basically, we need a holistic approach to trade facilitation to bring down trade costs to make this potential trade commercially viable as well. Now, we need to be mindful of the fact that the idea of regional cooperation goes much beyond the scope of trade. And the first thing which comes to mind is climate change. And it's quite well known that South Asia is highly prone to natural disasters. The problem of climate change is, of course, very complex. It requires a significant departure from the conventional approaches, and it involves constant monitoring, research, investments, And for this, we need regional institutions which can act as knowledge repositories, institutions which facilitate both scientific and regulatory sides of research. Another whole area is adaptation, like climate smart agriculture approaches promoted by FAO, where we see institutions and technology coming together in very useful ways. One of the examples is that of RIMES, a regional institution which operates as an early warning system. RIMES has developed a climate forecast application which uses the forecasts, even medium-term, long-term climate projections, etc., for farming decisions. And this type of information can be used by all member countries. This is an example of combining institutional strength and technological advancements beyond the national level. Talking about institutions, just to give another example, one of the most regional institutions we need in a region like ours is a contingency food reserve. We already have an institutional framework in the form of SARC Food Bank, but it's yet to be fully operationalized. So one of our papers was exclusively focusing on operationalizing certain aspects of the SFB in response to a call to work with SFB board. And this paper looked at summing up similar up and running institutions like the ASEAN Food Reserve, and came up with some practical solutions. One of the main issues tackled by the paper was on deciding the ideal threshold for food emergency, where a member country can call upon the SFB when there is a need to do so. So finally, so obviously there is a lot of scope for regional cooperation. The areas that are covered under cooperation could be diverse and numerous. And for want of time, we will not be able to elaborate on all of this. But before concluding, I would like to leave with you a resource for those who wish to know more. This is a volume of collected papers from a project we did in 2020, Regional Cooperation for Food Security in South Asia. It presents what we call a 10-point regional agenda for Goal 2. I would like to acknowledge that SDPI is a contributor to this volume, and so are some of the other South Asian think tanks represented in the panel today. Regional cooperation in its broad sense is obviously a very vast topic, and we do not know how much of these topics we will be able to pursue aggressively, but it is quite clear that we cannot hope to keep track towards the zero hunger target by 2030, or at least come as close as possible to it without pursuing some of these strategies. So I stop here and will be happy to take questions if there are any. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph, for wonderful presentation and touching many areas of regional trade. Before I going to play the video message from our federal minister, I just quickly go through the panelists in the reverse order, so that we can discuss some questions which is important to discuss. First, to Joseph, do you mention that there are many opportunities and potential for agriculture trade in Pakistan? So regarding climate change and regional institutions you talked about, so you did you think about the political economy of decision making in policy circles in South Asian region, particularly India and Pakistan and in Bangladesh, and Nepal and Sri Lanka? So what key lesson quickly you can just share with us?
Well, it's true that as far as trade is concerned, right now, SAWTEE is not working as best as we want it to. That is for sure. But the ultimate point is that there is a huge scope for trade. So that is what the economics of it shows. So we need to bring down the more and more food products to preferential tariff rates. And there are instruments beyond SAWTEE. If you look at it, most of our sub-regional countries have bilateral arrangements. India has bilateral trade agreements with Sri Lanka, with Nepal, with Bhutan. Similarly, Pakistan has with Sri Lanka. So some of these bilateral agreements can be used in the interim until we come to a situation where we can get back on track with respect to SAWTEE's trade liberalization program. So that's one. And so the underlining point here is that the trade potential remains out there, which is very evident, which is very visible, and it has obvious positive impacts for food security, particularly, in terms of price stability and also affordability and so on.
Thank you. Thank you, Joseph. We have short of time, otherwise we have 2 more questions, but I move to Dr. Haque and Dr. Sophie and Iftikhar Saab. So if I pick up the idea that you mentioned in your last slide, that the urban agriculture program, which is very interesting. So can you highlight some very key aspect that what do you mean by that? And lastly, what standard of indicator of resilience, which are the key ones you identify and which you think it's very important to consider as a policy steps or actions, at least for medium or short or medium policy actions? Please, Dr. Sophie, Heather, or Iftikhar, anyone you can answer.
I'm happy to start answering and then the others can add if that's okay. So the urban agriculture work that we did was, the recommendations largely came from Metro Manila, where there's an existing urban agriculture program supported by the Mayor's Office. And I think our key recommendations from that would just be around that support from local government level, and working across multiple agencies to connect. It's similar to what Manoj was talking about, connecting producers more closely with consumers and shortening those supply chains to make them more resilient. And we found examples of where that was working really, really well in Metro Manila that we'd like to see applied in different cities. And then onto your second question, we selected different indicators for our typology, such as the change in household income and the proximity to cultivated land. But the recommendation that we're making is that depending on the nature of the shock or the current priority that a city is dealing with, you could substitute those for different indicators as appropriate. And it's just a way of comparing at an urban level rather than a national or a subnational level between different cities to show how resilience can be quite different across different dimensions of the food system. Would Sophie or Iftikhar like to add anything to what I've just said?
Yeah, that's fine. Dr. Sophie or Iftikhar, you want to add something? Or?
Yeah. Hi. Thanks, Heather. Yes, that's. Sorry, I'm just putting my camera. Not much to add. I was just going to say that we have, in addition to the publication, we do have a WFP Dakota report coming out that cover, the findings from the various cities, and we also have case studies. So that will, really link to what Heather said in terms of the intervention that we have selected. So we have a lot more information if colleagues and people are interested to find out more about, the intervention that link to the recommendation. So we can share also the links when those publications are up. But thanks very much for the opportunity, to have the presentation today. Iftikhar, over to you if you want to add anything.
Very much, colleagues, Sophie and Heather. And if we look back at the slide number 3 of the presentation, where actually Heather presented the land cover maps of Peshawar. So we can see a lot of green area around the urban area, maybe that is a suburban area. So when we talk about the urban agriculture, I think we need to have proper land use policies, because if we want to have the affordable food value chain to the urban communities, so it should be near to the urban communities, maybe in peri-urban or suburban areas. So we can promote the urban agriculture through land use policies, not maybe for example, in Islamabad, that is a master plan. So there are some dedicated areas which cannot be used for the settlements that are for the farming. So we need to look into this aspect as well. Over.
Thank you, Fakhar Saab. I know one quick question is with Dr. Sayema that you have mentioned about the social safety nets. So, what do you think it's declining or it's going to be strengthened in the perspective of COVID-19? We need your quick reply in this regard. Dr. Sayema?
Can you please, sorry, I was not able to hear. Can you please repeat?
Yes, you mentioned about the social safety nets. So, what do you think that these social safety nets are increasing or diminishing with the perspective of COVID-19 in Bangladesh? So, what is the trend actually?
The thing is like the government in the last budget and this fiscal year budget as well provided quite a increased allocation for the social safety net program. But the fact remains that in terms of the social safety net program and the incentive package, there are also some areas of improvement. For example, the government has a national social safety net strategy, which is trying to adopt people at all stages of their life, especially targeting the children and especially targeting those who are vulnerable in the urban areas, because we know that in the COVID-19, a lot of urban people have lost their job. So that is a way of improvement that the government is trying to do and have in their plan. But at the moment, in the last 2 fiscal years budget, we have seen increased in social protection allocation, and that has and to bring some of the vulnerable upazilas, some of the sub-regions to give universal coverage. So that is some positive policy direction from the point of view of the government. But still, there are a lot of things that has to be done. And one is to implement the national NSSS, the National Social Safety Net Program. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Manoj, just quickly, if you mention some efforts or policy actions by the government regarding the e-commerce or you mentioned about the e-commerce and also the agriculture, e-agriculture. So do you have some points regarding the policy steps taken by the government, Sri Lankan government?
Actually, increase the connectivity during the COVID-19 has been emerged as one of the priority, not only in government policies, but in the private sector as well. Especially in terms of consumption from the consumer side, supermarket had started a lot of programs to deliver the goods online. So this was like there was a mushroom in demand for that. So that is one aspect. From the production side as well, farmers were increasingly using different e-commerce platforms. We have several private sector initiatives like Govipal app, and also from the national, from the telecommunication providers like Dialog. They have different app-based e-commerce platforms that government is also trying to digitalize their extension programs under e-agriculture programs, which is one of the Asia's first programs, e-agriculture policies that was developed in 2016. So there are several initiatives are going on. I hope in the future this will be better than now.
Thank you. Dikshya, just very short reply. In a sense, you mentioned about the public-private partnership in Nepal. So what are the areas of investment actually they are doing with the perspective of COVID-19?
Not exactly. Thank you, Kashif. Not exactly with the perspective of COVID-19, but like all of the panelists have kind of emphasized on taking agriculture bit digital. So yeah, a lot of like Dr. Manoj said with regard to Sri Lanka, in Nepal as well, a lot of e-commerce sites have come up after the COVID pandemic. A lot of them were already there, but they were not as prominent. And government has also recognized the importance of this kind of digital connectivity between farmers and even between farmers and the agents and also to the market. So a lot of things are happening in this regard, and we hope to see this momentum will kind of help bringing this e-commerce into prominence, and as well as there will be policies that will recognize importance of how to use this newfound digital kind of digital disruption that could help the agriculture farmers as well as the consumers.
Thank you, Dikshya. We have actually lots of questions, but because of shorter time, we just move to the last part, which is the video message from Minister Syed Imam, Federal Minister of Food, National Food Security and Research, Government of Pakistan. He also served as Speaker of National Assembly of Pakistan from 1985 to 1986, and he himself is a progressive farmer. So I just play its visual message, and then we conclude the session later on.
This conference, the Sustainable Development Policy Institute, for organizing this panel at the 24th Sustainable Development Conference. The panel title is Building Local Resilient Food Systems to End Hunger, Leaving No One Behind. Progress on the food security and nutrition has been rather slow compared to other regions in South Asia, which, according to the figures that we have, is not on track to achieve the 2030 SDG targets. The high prevalence of hunger has a significant challenge in South Asia. Recent estimates show that the number of severe to moderate food insecure population is amongst the highest in South Asia, which is approximately 682 million people, according to FAO, UNICEF, WFP, and WHO. Over 36% households are food insecure and 14% are malnourished. South Asia, with 55.9 million stunted people and 25.2 million wasted children, are amongst the highest in Asia. The situation in Pakistan is such that a national nutrition survey, which was conducted in 2018-19, showed over 37% of the households are food insecure, 14% malnourished, and 40% of the children under 5 years of age have stunted growth. The impact of COVID-19 on food security systems. Estimates show that an additional 6.7 billion children in Asia and the Pacific region with wasting is due to COVID-19, with an estimated 57.6% of these children living in South Asia, according to estimates by FAO, UNICEF, WFP, and WHO. The impact on Pakistan. On the supply side, food supply disruptions during lockdown, particularly in the livestock and dairy sectors, the accessibility to the urban markets, feed and vaccination, and payment of rents and utility bills was very challenging. The losses in fruits and vegetable crops was a very prominent aspect on the supply side. Transportation restrictions, shortage of labor and machinery, increasing farm input prices, farmers' limited access to the market caused major disruptions on food supply chain. Cereal crops, wheat, rice, corn were the least affected, and fresh products, especially crops, vegetables and fruits, were most affected. On the demand side, most of the people reported reduced food consumption up to 50%, the loss in physical access to food, loss of purchasing power due to unemployment. The daily laborers are at a risk due to loss of work and decline of food consumption. Reduced rural household incomes diversification was also a major factor. Government initiatives, policy actions amid COVID-19. There was a digital food security dashboard which was created. A food security digital dashboard was developed at the district level for essential food commodities, indicating the status of food production, consumption, stocks, and prices across the country for an effective and informed decision making. The ASAS program, cash transfer to 12 million households of rupees 176 billion for the poor and daily wage workers. Wheat procurement increased to about 6.6 million tons compared to 4.25 million tons in the previous year. Subsidy on certified seed and fertilizers was given. Subsidy for agriculture, 1.5 billion rupees for fertilizer and tractor, rupees 6.8 billion, waiving the markup on agricultural loans for households owning less than 12.5 acres. The Ministry of Food Security and Research announced subsidy on the pesticides for cotton pests. And the last was the smart lockdowns. The impact of these policies initiative during lockdown months, poverty rate that went up by 53% from 48% pre-COVID in the rural areas. Later, it declined to 35.9% due to these governmental launch schemes. What is the way forward? The way forward, the region needs to have be better prepared for and build resilience in future disasters and pandemics. Joint and comprehensive strategies are required to improve food production, protect farm incomes and labor, ensure access to better health services, and increase social transfers. To build for future disasters and epidemics, there is need to invest in stronger disaster preparedness, early warning systems, and response systems, learning from the COVID-19 pandemic. Risk assessments for local food supply chain need to improve to develop the capacity for local and provincial level food. Agricultural and public administrative department officials for better and timely risk assessment related to COVID-19 pandemic and other disasters. On farm, digital innovations such as digital agricultural advisory, off-farm digital connectivity to food traders and processors essentially required for efficient food systems in agriculture. Improve the role of the private sector to encourage investment for efficient, affordable and accessible storage facilities for farmers, small-scale traders and middlemen to secure the food supply chains. Thank you much. The organizers of this conference, Sustainable Development.
Thank you. Thank you very much for listening. So, can you share your on your video so that we can have a group photo? Please share screen. You can take the. Sansa, you can you
Dr. Sophie is her camera is still off.
Yes, Dr. Abid. Myself is actually I have a problem, so I shifted to this. So you can. Yeah. Just 1 minute. Thank you very much. We have captured photo. So we just need to conclude the session. Actually, what I observe and actually we are is that the issues regarding to the micro level at the farm level, the issues are quite similar in South Asian countries. We particularly during the COVID, we face the unavailability of farm inputs and timely availability of food. So we have limited number of social security programs. We need to have an efficient procurement systems and agriculture financing and active or more effective agriculture extensions. And most importantly, we need to have some e-commerce or e-agriculture that need to be introduced in the South Asian countries. So there are a number of suggestions and recommendations. So one idea is that we can develop this policy brief on that, and then we can share with each other. So we will do it later on, and with due course of times, we share with you some draft. So thank you very much for your participation. Actually, we learned a lot. Hopefully next year we can meet in person in Pakistan, and we have a better discussion and coordination. So thank you very much, and see you next year. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. I have requested Dr. Heather to please stay for a while, and maybe we can end Facebook Live. I need to take her thought.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I request our IT colleague to please end Facebook Live? Yeah, it has ended. Hi, Dr. Heather.
Hi.
Sorry for the last minute request. I was assigned this session to take sort of one of the guests, which, we'll be using this for our YouTube channel and our web-based television, which is SDTV. I'll just take here 2-3 more minutes. So,
sorry, what does that involve? What do you need me to do?
I'll just ask one question, and we'll just expect your response to that. And the question is, just let me share in advance that this question is, you presented research which I was just attending, and it is related to that in generic, that what was the impact of pandemic on food availability in Peshawar? You just have to respond to that. So just tell me whenever you are ready, I'll start.
Okay.
So maybe you will just reduce little bit headspace on you, because it won't be fit well while editing in the camera. Sorry. This headspace, it's a bit more. Yeah, maybe you can reduce. It's more actually. You have to reduce. Yes, like this. Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
Perfect. I'll just have to keep it here. So just let me know whenever you're ready. I should start then.
Okay, yeah, I'm ready.
Great. A very important session on food security in collaboration with WFP and SAWTEE has just ended, where panelists has presented research from different parts of the world. We have with us Dr. Heather Ohly, who presented a very interesting research, which was based in Pakistan research actually, and that data would be very useful for Pakistan as well. Thank you very much, Dr. Heather Ohly, for your time. I have just this one question, what does your research tell us that what was the impact of pandemic in past 2 years on food availability in Peshawar particularly?
Well, in terms of food availability, we actually found that food supply in the markets was only very temporarily affected during the most acute phases of the lockdowns. And actually recovered reasonably quickly. But of course, food prices were affected and food accessibility was affected. So our study looks at how that impacted on the urban poor who were faced with a combination of increasing food prices and also loss of income. So the biggest impact from what we observed through our own research and looking at secondary data was more to do with food accessibility and affordability, which really impacted on food insecurity in the city of Peshawar.
Thank you very much, Dr. Heather, for your response. This is Mariam Shabir from the side event of Sustainable Development Conference happening at Margala and Serena simultaneously and online as well. Stay with us for the next 2 days. Thank you so much, Dr. Heather.
Oh, no problem. Nice to meet you.
Likewise. Thank you. I'm basically a digital communication head at SDPI, also environmentalist. So,
great. Well, I used to work in Pakistan quite a lot, but I haven't been there for a while. So it's nice to be connected to it through the conference.
Yeah, it's great to see you and hope this pandemic will over, which is not soon, I guess, due to variants, but we can hope.
Yeah,
until then,
so.
hope to see you in Pakistan again.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you.